The sun is setting over the Solomon Islands, April 1942. The radio crackles. Zeros, 3 o'clock high. Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thatch yanks his F4F Wildcat into a climbing turn, his gloved hand white-knuckled on the control stick. Behind him, two more Wildcats follow, their Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp engines screaming at full throttle. The smell of aviation fuel and hot oil fills the cramped cockpit. His heart hammers against his ribcage. He's already lost 3 pilots this week. Good men. Boys, really. Most of them barely 20 years old, gone in seconds of fire and smoke. The enemy comes down like hawks. 6 Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, their pale gray-green camouflage gleaming in the dying light. They're impossibly fast, impossibly graceful. One breaks left in a turn so tight it defies physics, a maneuver no American aircraft can match. Thatch's wingman tries to follow, tries to get his guns on target. Fatal mistake. The Zero simply pivots in midair, rolls inverted, and puts a burst of 20mm cannon fire through the Wildcat engine cowling. Smoke. Flames. The stricken fighter corkscrews toward the ocean below. Thatch doesn't see a parachute. It's the nightmare American pilots face every single day in the spring of 1942. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero isn't just superior, it's a ghost, a myth, a demon that can climb faster, turn tighter, and reach farther than any fighter in the Allied arsenal. Pilots whisper about it in ready rooms across the Pacific. Some claim it can pull 10G turns without breaking apart. Others swear its pilots have some kind of mystical training, some ancient samurai skill that makes them invincible. The truth is simpler and more terrifying. The Americans are facing an enemy they don't understand, and they're dying because of it. The Zero first appeared over China in 1940, shredding obsolete Soviet-built fighters flown by Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers and Chinese nationalist pilots. By the time Japan launched its attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the Zero had already compiled a combat record of almost mythological proportions. Over 500 confirmed kills with only 2 aircraft lost in combat. When war came to the Pacific, American commanders expected the Japanese to field cheap copies of Western designs, flimsy aircraft flown by pilots handicapped by poor eyesight, racist propaganda that cost lives. Instead, the F4F Wildcats, P-40 Warhawks, and Brewster Buffaloes encountered something that could outfight them in almost every measurable category. The Zero had a maximum speed of 331 miles per hour at altitude, powered by a Nakajima Sake 12 14-cylinder double-row radial engine, producing 950 horsepower. It could climb at 3,100 feet per minute, nearly twice the rate of the Wildcat. Its range was staggering, 1,929 miles, meaning it could escort bombers deep into Allied territory and still have fuel to dogfight on the way home. But the real killer was maneuverability. With a wingspan of 39 feet 4 inches and an empty weight of just 3,704 pounds, the Zero was a featherweight ballerina armed with 2 7.7mm Type 97 machine guns in the engine cowling and 2 devastating 20mm Type 99 cannon in the wings. In a turning fight, the bread and butter of air combat doctrine in 1942, the Zero could simply circle inside any Allied fighter, line up its gun sight, and fire. American pilots watched their friends explode in flames, unable to evade, unable to fight back. By May 1942, morale among American naval aviators was approaching collapse. At the Battle of the Coral Sea, 4 Wildcats engaged 4 Zeros, escorting Japanese torpedo bombers. The Americans managed to draw, no losses on either side, but only because they refused to dogfight, and instead used slashing, hit-and-run attacks that left them constantly on the defensive. Pilots returned to their carriers shaken, reporting an enemy aircraft that seemed supernatural in its capabilities. The cold mathematics of air combat were brutally simple. The side with the better aircraft controlled the sky, and whoever controlled the sky controlled the war. American factories could build more planes. American training programs could graduate more pilots. But if those pilots were being shot down at unsustainable rates, the war would be lost before industrial production could turn the tide. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, faced a strategic nightmare. Intelligence reports suggested Japan was preparing a massive operation against Midway Island, a critical American base. If Midway fell, Hawaii would be threatened. But how could his carriers defeat a numerically superior Japanese force when every single carrier-based fighter squadron reported the same thing? We cannot beat the Zero in a fair fight. Thatch himself, one of the Navy's most brilliant tacticians, had spent weeks developing a defensive maneuver, a scissoring weave pattern that allowed two Wildcats to cover each other and create crossing fields of fire. He called it the beam defense position. His pilots called it the Thatch weave. It worked, barely, by refusing to engage the Zero on its terms. But it was a defensive tactic, a survival mechanism. It couldn't win the war. What the Americans needed was intelligence. They needed to understand the Zero's secrets, to strip away the myth and find the machine beneath. They needed to know its weaknesses, its limitations, the flaws that every aircraft possessed. They needed to capture one intact. In the freezing waters and fog-shrouded islands of the North Pacific, 5,000 miles from the tropical battlefields of the South Pacific, that impossible opportunity was about to fall from the sky.
June 3, 1942. Akutan Island, Aleutian Islands, Alaska Territory. Flight Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga is 19 years old and dying. His hands are slick with blood inside his leather flight gloves. The oil pressure gauge on his instrument panel is dropping towards zero. Behind him, through the bullet-riddled fuselage of his Mitsubishi A6M Zero, serial number 4593, a thin stream of black smoke trails across the gray Alaskan sky. The smell of burning oil and hydraulic fluid fills his oxygen mask. Every breath tastes like metal and fear. 30 minutes ago, Koga had been part of a precision strike on Dutch Harbor, a remote American naval base on Unalaska Island. His flight had launched from the aircraft carrier Ryujo, part of Admiral Kakuji Kakuta's Northern Force, a deception operation designed to draw American attention away from the main Japanese offensive against Midway Island, 2,000 miles to the south. The plan was elegant. Bomb the Americans in the frozen north, occupy a few worthless islands, and force Admiral Nimitz to split his forces. The mission had gone perfectly until it hadn't. Koga and his wingmen, Tsuguo Shikata and Makoto Endo, had strafed the harbor facilities, their 20mm cannon ripping through warehouses and oil storage tanks. Then they'd spotted a fat target, an American PBY-5A Catalina flying boat moored in the harbor. Koga dove, his Zero's engine howling. The Catalina never had a chance. His cannon shells walked across the fuselage, igniting fuel tanks and tearing through the crew compartment. The flying boat, piloted by Lieutenant Bud Mitchell, exploded in a fireball that killed all 7 men aboard. It was in that moment, low and slow over the harbor, that someone fired the shot that changed the war. Nobody knows exactly who pulled the trigger. The 206th Coast Artillery Regiment had .5 caliber machine guns and 3-inch anti-aircraft guns positioned around Dutch Harbor. Navy ships in the harbor were firing as well, their guns creating a spider web of tracers across the sky. Photographic evidence later examined by American intelligence would show that Koga Zero was hit by small arms fire, .5 caliber rounds, maybe smaller, from both above and below. One of those rounds, probably fired by a terrified gunner who never knew if he'd hit anything, severed the oil return line to Koga's Nakajima Sakai engine. The damage was catastrophic, but not immediately fatal. Oil began spraying across the hot cylinder heads.
Temperature spiked. Koga immediately reduced throttle, nursing the engine, trying to keep it from seizing completely. His Zero slowed. Tsuguo Shikada and Makoto Endo formed up on his wings, their aircraft pristine and undamaged. They had a rendezvous point, Akutan Island, 25 miles east of Dutch Harbor, designated for emergency landings. Waiting near the island was a Japanese submarine, I-25, assigned to pick up downed pilots. If Koga could reach Akutan, if he could land without destroying the aircraft, he might survive. The flight to Akutan took 15 agonizing minutes. Koga's engine coughed and stuttered, temperature climbing into the red zone. He could see Akutan now through the perpetual fog, a barren, treeless volcanic rock jutting from the Bering Sea, snow-covered peaks, black sand beaches, and there, half a mile inland from Broad Bight, a flat stretch of land covered with green grass. Tsuguo circled low, examining the emergency landing site. The grass looked thick, inviting. Solid ground, he thought, but on his second pass, something caught his eye. A glint of reflected light. Water. The field wasn't solid ground at all. It was a bog, saturated marshland covered by a deceptive layer of tundra grass. Tsuguo suddenly realized his mistake. He frantically signaled Koga, belly landing, do not lower your gear." But Koga was already committed. His landing gear was down and locked. He was at 200 feet, 100 feet, 50 feet. The Zero's main wheels kissed the grass at exactly 85 miles per hour. For one beautiful second, it seemed like everything would be fine. Then the wheels sank. The landing gear punched through the surface and buried itself in soft mud. The Zero's forward momentum translated instantly into a violent deceleration, from 85 miles an hour to 0 in less than 20 feet. Koga's body was thrown forward against his shoulder harness with a force exceeding 9 Gs. His neck snapped, vertebrae shattered, his skull fractured against the gun sight. The impact was instantaneous and absolute. The aircraft flipped forward, stood on its nose for one impossible moment, and then settled back onto its belly. The Nakajima Sakai engine, already damaged and overheating, seized completely with a final shuddering groan. Steam hissed from ruptured coolant lines, and then silence. Tsuguo and Endo circled overhead horrified. Koga Zero sat upright in the marsh, its landing gear crumpled but the fuselage intact. Koga himself sat in the cockpit, motionless over the controls, dead on impact. There was nothing they could do. No rescue was possible. The submarine would never risk surfacing to recover a body. Japanese doctrine was clear. If you couldn't bring back a pilot, you destroyed the aircraft to prevent enemy capture. But Tsuguo and Endo were low on fuel and ammunition. They had no incendiary rounds left, and the standing water around Koga Zero made fire impossible. The aircraft had crashed in the one place on the entire island where flames wouldn't spread. After a final pass, the two surviving pilots turned south and climbed into the overcast, leaving their friend's body and Japan's most advanced fighter aircraft sitting intact in an Alaskan swamp. For 5 weeks, Koga Zero remained undiscovered. The war moved on. The Battle of Midway ended in a catastrophic Japanese defeat. 4 carriers sunk. The tide of the Pacific War reversed. But in the Aleutians, the fog rolled in and out, and the dead pilot sat alone in his tomb of aluminum and steel. Then, on July 10, 1942, a U.S. Navy PBY Catalina flying boat piloted by Lieutenant William Bill Teese was conducting a routine patrol over Akutan Island when his co-pilot spotted something impossible. A perfectly intact Japanese Zero fighter sitting upright in a marsh, its red Hinomaru roundels visible through the dissipating fog. Teese circled 3 times, unable to believe what he was seeing. Then he grabbed the radio microphone and sent a transmission that would change the course of the air war. "I've found a Zero. Repeat, I have located an intact enemy Zero fighter on Akutan Island. Request immediate salvage team." The recovery operation was about to begin.
The orders came down from the highest levels. Recover the aircraft at all costs. Captain Ralph Parker, commanding officer of the naval base at Dutch Harbor, assembled a team with impossible requirements. They needed aviation mechanics who could disassemble a delicate fighter aircraft under field conditions. They needed engineers who understood Japanese construction techniques. They needed armed guards in case Japanese patrols came looking for their missing plane. And they needed to do all of this on a barren, fog-shrouded island in the middle of enemy-controlled waters without being detected. The salvage ship USS Williamson departed Dutch Harbor on July 12, 1942, carrying a hand-picked crew of 22 men. Chief Aviation Machinist Mate Albert Knack led the technical team, mechanics who had never seen a Zero except through gun sights. They brought cutting torches, winches, timber mats, and enough weaponry to fight off a Japanese landing party. The voyage to Akutan took 8 hours through seas that could turn deadly without warning. When they arrived at Broadbight, the recovery team confronted a nightmare of logistics. Koga Zero sat half a mile inland across terrain that could charitably be called treacherous. The bog that had killed the Japanese pilot was a maze of sucking mud, hidden channels of freezing water, and tussocks of marsh grass that collapsed under any weight. The temperature hovered just above freezing, fog reduced visibility to 20 yards. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so thick they obscured vision. And somewhere out there, possibly watching through binoculars, Japanese forces occupied Kiska and Attu Islands less than 200 miles to the west. The first challenge was simply reaching the aircraft. The team laid a corduroy road, logs placed perpendicular to the direction of travel, across the worst sections of marsh. Every piece of timber had to be carried from the beach. Men sank to their waists in mud. Equipment disappeared into sinkholes. It took 3 days just to build a usable path. When they finally reached the Zero, Knack and his mechanics stood in silent awe. The aircraft was almost pristine. Yes, the landing gear was destroyed. Yes, bullet holes perforated the fuselage and wings, 15 hits total, mostly 50 caliber. But the structure was intact. The Nakajima Sakai engine was seized but undamaged. The 20mm Type 99 cannon were loaded and ready to fire. This wasn't wreckage, this was an intelligence goldmine. Koga's body remained in the cockpit, frozen in death. The recovery team removed him with ceremony and buried him nearby, marking the grave with a simple wooden cross. Whatever else the pilot had been, he died doing his duty. The Americans understood that much. Now came the delicate work. The Zero had to be disassembled, transported across the bog, loaded onto the ship, and shipped to the mainland without damaging critical components. Knack decided to remove the wings but keep the fuselage intact. His team worked around the clock, fueled by coffee and the knowledge that Japanese reconnaissance aircraft could appear at any moment. They removed inspection panels and marveled at the engineering. The Zero's internal structure was a work of art, beautifully welded aluminum longerons and formers, fabric-covered control surfaces, every component optimized for weight savings. The wings came off first, unbolted at the wing root attach points. Each wing weighed barely 200 pounds, impossibly light compared to American designs. The team wrapped them in canvas and lashed them to improvised sleds. Then came the fuselage. Using block and tackle, they lifted the nose and built a cradle underneath. Inch by inch, they dragged it across the corduroy road toward the beach. Loading the Zero onto the Williamson took another full day. The ship's crane couldn't reach inland, so everything had to be manhandled to the waterline first. By July 16th, 4 days after landing, the recovery team had the aircraft aboard and secured. Knack stood on deck staring at the crated components and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. They'd done it. Against all odds, they'd recovered Japan's superweapon intact. The Williamson steamed south through fog and rough seas, her crew under strict orders to maintain radio silence. The Zero was crated below decks, hidden from prying eyes. If a Japanese submarine intercepted them now, the entire operation would be for nothing. But luck held. On July 20th, the ship docked at Dutch Harbor without incident. From there, the crated Zero was transferred to a larger transport and shipped to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, California. When the crates arrived at North Island on August 12, 1942, a team of naval engineers and intelligence officers crowded the hangar. Captain Frank McCrary, chief of the Technical Air Intelligence Center, personally supervised the unpacking. As the crates were pried open and the Zero's components emerged, wings, fuselage, engine, propeller, the room fell silent. This was the enemy. This was the weapon that had terrorized Allied pilots across the Pacific. And now, it belonged to the United States Navy. The test program was about to begin.
September 1942. Naval Air Station North Island, San Diego, California. Lieutenant Commander Eddie R. Sanders stands in Hangar 6, studying the reassembled Zero with the intensity of a surgeon examining a patient before a life-or-death operation. Sanders is one of the Navy's finest test pilots, a veteran aviator with over 2,000 flight hours and a reputation for precision flying. He's been selected to fly the enemy's most dangerous aircraft, and if anything goes wrong, he'll die in Japanese fire without honor. The Zero has been repainted. The red Hinomaru roundels, the meatballs that American gunners aimed for, have been covered with U.S. Navy blue circles and white stars. It looks obscene, Sanders thinks, like watching a wolf wear sheep's clothing. For 2 weeks, mechanics have worked 16-hour shifts repairing crash damage and unfreezing the seized engine. The Nakajima Sakai 12 was flushed, cleaned, and reassembled with captured Japanese lubricants. New hydraulic lines were fabricated. The landing gear, destroyed in the crash, was rebuilt using salvaged components from other Japanese aircraft and American parts machined to Japanese specifications. Every fastener was inspected. Every control cable was checked and rechecked. Sanders has spent the past week studying every inch of the aircraft. He's memorized the instrument panel, all Japanese characters, incomprehensible without the translated diagram intelligence prepared. He's practiced the startup sequence until he can do it blindfolded. He knows the throttle response curve, the fuel mixture settings, the quirks of the Japanese electrical system. But there's a difference between ground study and flying. And nobody in the United States has ever flown a Zero and lived to talk about it. September 20, 1942. Dawn. Sanders climbs into the cockpit. The seat is surprisingly comfortable, but cramped, designed for the smaller average stature of Japanese pilots. The smell is distinctly foreign. Machine oil, Japanese silk insulation, a faint odor of fish-based sealant that Japanese manufacturers used. The control stick is shorter than he's used to, the throttle quadrant positioned differently. Everything feels wrong in subtle ways. He signals the ground crew. Switch is on, magnetos armed, fuel mixture rich. He primes the cylinders and then hits the starter. The Nakajima Sakai engine turns over once, twice, then roars to life with a sound like tearing canvas. The whole aircraft shudders. Blue-gray exhaust smoke billows from the 14 cylinders. The propeller, a massive three-blade Hamilton Standard unit captured with the aircraft, spins up to 800 RPM. Sanders runs through the pre-flight checklist, watching the gauges climb into normal ranges. Oil pressure, good. Cylinder head temperature, rising normally. Fuel pressure, stable. The engine sounds healthy, powerful, surprisingly smooth for something that had been seized in an Alaskan bog 2 months ago. He advances the throttle. The Zero lurches forward. The tail comes up almost immediately. The lightweight airframe is absurdly responsive. Sanders taps the brakes, Japanese pedals, Japanese hydraulics, and the aircraft slews left. He corrects, gets the nose pointed down the runway, and pushes the throttle to full power. The acceleration is startling. Within 500 feet, the Zero is airborne, climbing at an angle that seems impossible. Sanders glances at the altimeter. It's unwinding like a stopwatch. 1,000 feet per minute, 2,000 feet per minute, 3,000 feet per minute. The horizon drops away. In less than 90 seconds, he's at 10,000 feet. The American F4F Wildcat would still be struggling through 5,000 feet. Sanders levels off and begins the test program. First, basic handling. He banks left. The ailerons respond instantly, almost too sensitively. He tries a right turn. Same thing. The Zero pivots like it's hinged at the center of gravity. He tries a loop. It's effortless. He tries a roll. The aircraft snaps inverted in less than 2 seconds. This is what American pilots have been facing, this insane maneuverability. Sanders feels a cold knot of fear in his stomach. If the Zero has no weaknesses, if it's this good in every regime, then the war is going to be much longer and bloodier than anyone imagined. But then he pushes the stick forward, -G. The nose drops toward the ocean, the horizon tilts, and the Nakajima Sakai engine coughs, sputters, and dies. There it is, the first weakness. The Zero's carburetor is a float-type design, simple, lightweight, and completely unable to handle negative G-forces. Under negative acceleration, fuel is forced away from the intake. The engine starves and quits until positive G is restored. This means the Zero cannot follow an American aircraft through a pushover dive. If a Wildcat or P-38 pilot pushes into a negative G descent, the Zero will lose power and fall behind. Sanders makes a note on his kneeboard and continues the test program. Over the next 25 days, Sanders flies the Zero 24 times. Each flight is meticulously planned. Speed tests, climb tests, dive tests, gunnery simulations against American fighters. Engineers install instrumentation that measures control forces, flutter characteristics, structural loads. The NACA Langley Research Center sends specialists to conduct wind tunnel tests. Every flight reveals more data, more insights, more exploitable weaknesses. The Zero's strengths are exactly what American pilots reported. Phenomenal maneuverability at low speeds, excellent rate of climb, extraordinary range. In a turning fight below 200 knots, the Zero is unbeatable. Its large ailerons and lightweight structure allow it to outturn anything the Allies have. But at high speed, everything changes. At speeds above 250 knots, about 287 miles per hour, Sanders discovers that the Zero's ailerons become nearly immovable. The control stick requires both hands and full body weight to achieve even small roll rates. The large fabric-covered ailerons that provide such beautiful low-speed response are generating enormous aerodynamic forces at high speed. Japanese engineers never installed hydraulic boosters or trim tabs to reduce control forces. To save weight, they kept the control system pure mechanical linkage. This means that above 250 knots, the Zero cannot roll quickly, especially to the right. Something about the propeller torque makes right rolls even more difficult. An American fighter diving at high speed can easily roll away from a Zero's guns because the Japanese pilot physically cannot follow the maneuver fast enough. Sanders also confirms what every American gunner already knew. The Zero is fragile. It has no armor plating protecting the pilot. The seatback is thin aluminum. A single .50 caliber round to the cockpit area is usually fatal. The fuel tanks, located in the fuselage and wings, have no self-sealing capability. A single incendiary round can turn the aircraft into a fireball. Japanese engineers sacrificed protection for weight savings, gambling that superior agility would keep pilots alive. Against poorly trained Chinese pilots in obsolete aircraft, that gamble paid off. Against American pilots who now understood the Zero's limitations, it would be suicide. By October 15, 1942, Sanders completes his final test flight. He lands the Zero, taxis to the hangar, and shuts down the engine for the last time. Ground crew swarm the aircraft, already preparing it for transport to the NACA facility at Langley for full-scale wind tunnel testing. Sanders climbs out of the cockpit and is immediately surrounded by intelligence officers demanding his report. He looks at them, exhausted, and says something they'll never forget. "Gentlemen, the Zero isn't a superweapon. It's a glass cannon, and we can beat it."
The impact of Sanders' test flights was immediate and overwhelming. Within days of his initial report, the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics began disseminating tactical bulletins to every carrier air group in the Pacific Fleet. The bulletins were blunt, technical, and brutally specific. Zero tactical limitations, confidential. High-speed maneuverability. Above 250 knots indicated airspeed, the Zero's aileron control forces become excessive. Roll rates are severely degraded. The aircraft requires 2 to 3 seconds to achieve a 90-degree bank angle at high speed versus less than 1 second for the F4F Wildcat. Negative G performance. The Zero's float-type carburetor cannot sustain negative acceleration. The engine will starve and quit under pushover conditions. This can be exploited by diving away using a pushover maneuver rather than a pull-down. Structural fragility. The Zero lacks armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks. Concentrated .5 caliber fire will destroy the aircraft. Aim for the fuselage centerline where fuel tanks are located. Dive limitations. The Zero cannot sustain dives above 350 knots without risking structural failure. American fighters can outdive the Zero and escape to lower altitude. Recommended tactics. Do not attempt to turn fight the Zero at low speeds. Use vertical maneuvers. Dive, climb, dive again. Maintain speed above 250 knots. Use altitude advantage. Engage in high-speed slashing attacks. If caught in a turning fight, push into a negative G dive to cause Zero engine failure, then roll hard right at high speed to evade. Pilots who had been fighting blind for 9 months suddenly had a manual for survival. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, Marine pilots fighting brutal daily battles against Japanese air attacks read the bulletins with reverence. Captain Joe Foss, already an ace with 9 kills, gathered his squadron and held an impromptu seminar. "Forget everything you learned about dogfighting," he told them. "We're not dogfighters anymore. We're assassins. We dive, we shoot, we climb away. No exceptions." The new tactics required discipline.
Every instinct screamed at pilots to turn with an enemy, to engage in the swirling, gut-wrenching dogfights that defined aerial combat. But the Zero punished that instinct. Pilots who followed the new doctrine, boom and zoom, hit and run, maintain speed at all costs, started winning. Lieutenant Commander Todd's weave maneuver, combined with knowledge of the Zero's high-speed limitations, became devastatingly effective. When Zeros engaged a weaving pair of Wildcats, they were forced to commit to an attack. Once committed, the American pilots could bait the Zero into high-speed pursuit, then suddenly reverse with a hard right roll that the Zero could not follow. The pursuing Japanese pilot would find himself overshooting, target lost, with an American fighter sliding onto his tail. The psychological impact was equally profound. For 9 months, American pilots had believed they were fighting a superior enemy with a technological advantage. Now they understood the truth. The Zero was a specialized tool, optimized for a specific type of combat. Outside that narrow envelope, it was vulnerable. Japanese pilots weren't supermen. They were trapped in aircraft that couldn't adapt to American tactics. The captured Zero's intelligence also directly influenced aircraft design. The Grumman F4F Wildcat, already in development in early 1942, underwent significant modifications based on Sanders' reports. Engineers at Grumman designed metal-covered ailerons with hydraulic boosting to ensure high-speed control authority. They installed pressure carburetors that could sustain -G without fuel starvation. They added heavy armor plating behind the pilot's seat and self-sealing fuel tanks throughout the fuselage. The Wildcat would be 2,000 pounds heavier than the Zero, but it would be immune to the Japanese fighter's primary weapons, agility and surprise. When the F4F Wildcat entered service in early 1943, it carried the genetic signature of the Akutan Zero's intelligence. Wildcat pilots, armed with knowledge of Zero limitations and flying in aircraft specifically designed to exploit those weaknesses, achieved a kill ratio of 19-1 against Japanese fighters. 19 Zeros destroyed for every Wildcat lost. By late 1943, the air war in the Pacific had completely reversed. Japanese pilots, many of them inexperienced replacements for the elite veterans lost at Midway and Guadalcanal, found themselves facing American pilots who refused to fight on Japanese terms. The Americans climbed above Japanese formations, dove through them at speeds the Zero couldn't match, and escaped before the Zeros could bring their superior agility to bear. When Zeros tried to pursue, they encountered the Wildcat's superior high-speed performance and brutal firepower. The Akutan Zero itself continued to serve American intelligence throughout the war. After Sanders' test flights, it was transferred to the Naka-Langley Research Center, where it underwent extensive wind tunnel testing. Engineers mapped its aerodynamic characteristics with scientific precision. Every measurement, every data point refined American understanding of Japanese design philosophy. In February 1945, the Zero's service ended in an accident that was almost poetic in its irony. While taxiing for another test flight at NAS North Island, a Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver dive bomber lost control and crashed into the parked Zero. The Helldiver's propeller sliced through the Japanese fighter like a chainsaw, reducing it to wreckage. After surviving combat, crash landing, recovery, and countless test flights, the Akutan Zero was destroyed by American carelessness. But by then, it had already won the war. Wars are won by intelligence as much as firepower. The capture and analysis of the Akutan Zero represents one of the most significant intelligence coups of World War II. A single intact aircraft, recovered through luck and determination, provided the United States with the tactical and technical knowledge necessary to defeat what had been, for 9 months, a seemingly invincible enemy weapon. The Zero's mystique died in the California desert, dissected by engineers and exploited by pilots who learned to fight smarter rather than harder. By 1944, American air groups dominated the Pacific skies. The F4F Wildcat, the F4U Corsair, and later the P-51 Mustang all benefited directly or indirectly from intelligence derived from the Akutan Zero. Japanese engineers, aware that their premier fighter had been compromised, attempted to develop improved models. The A6M Model 52 featured stronger wing structures and slightly improved dive performance, but the fundamental design remained unchanged, lightweight, agile, and fatally vulnerable to American tactics. Japan lacked the industrial capacity and raw materials to develop an entirely new fighter design, so they continued producing Zeros until the end of the war. By 1945, the Zero was obsolete, easily outclassed by American designs that had learned all its secrets. The men who recovered the Zero from that Alaskan bog never received public recognition during the war. The operation remained classified to prevent the Japanese from understanding how thoroughly their weapon had been compromised. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders continued as a test pilot, eventually transitioning to jet aircraft after the war. He rarely spoke about his time flying the Zero, but colleagues reported that he kept a small piece of the aircraft's fuselage as a memento, a reminder of the day he'd climbed into an enemy cockpit and discovered how to win a war. Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga's body was eventually recovered from its grave on Akutan Island and returned to Japan for proper burial. He was 19 years old when he died, one of thousands of young men consumed by a war they didn't start. His final, fatal mistake, lowering his landing gear over that Alaskan bog, changed the course of history in ways he never could have imagined. The Pacific War would rage for another 3 years after the Zero's capture, consuming millions of lives in battles across vast oceanic expanses. But after September 1942, American pilots no longer feared the Zero. They understood it. They could beat it. And that knowledge, born from one intact aircraft recovered from impossible terrain, helped turn the tide of the war. In the final accounting, the Akutan Zero didn't just provide tactical advantages, it provided something equally valuable: confidence. American pilots who had spent months believing they were outmatched